AI predicts the rising tide. The acrid smell of smoke clung to the air, mingling with the salty tang of the ocean. Raylene pulled the scarf tighter around her nose and mouth, her eyes stinging as she squinted towards the horizon. The once blue sky was now a sullen, hazy grey. The sun reduced to a faint orange disk, barely visible through the thick veil of pollution. The fishing boats, once a vibrant fleet, now bobbed listlessly in the harbour, their hulls corroded by the acidic rain that fell more often than not. She remembered when this bay was teeming with life, the water so clear you could see the vibrant coral reefs just below the surface. Now, the water was murky, a sickly green that hinted at the decay beneath. The reefs had long since bleached, the fish disappearing along with them. The old men on the docks, those who still bothered to come, muttered about how the ocean had turned against them, as if it were a conscious decision. But Raylene knew better. It was nearly midday, and the air was already thick with heat, though the sun's rays barely penetrated the smog. She could feel the sweat pooling at the back of her neck, her clothes sticking uncomfortably to her skin. It was hotter every year, the cool seasons shorter and less distinct. The old weather patterns were a memory now, talked about by the elderly as if they were fairy tales. There was no telling when the rains would come or when they'd have to endure another drought. She began to walk, her boots crunching on the dry, cracked earth that had once been a bustling market street. Buildings stood half abandoned, their windows dark, the vibrant murals that had once adorned the walls now faded and peeling. The city had withdrawn into itself, its pulse slowing with each passing year as the tides rose and the water slowly claimed more and more of the coast. A cough broke the silence, a rough wheezing sound that cut through the thick air. Raylene turned to see a group of children, their faces gaunt and smudged with soot, playing in the dirt. They had fashioned makeshift masks from whatever they could find, a futile attempt to protect themselves from the toxins that hung in the air. She felt a pang of sorrow as she watched them. This world was all they had ever known. They would never see the fields of wildflowers that once bloomed in the spring, or hear the song of birds that had long since vanished from these parts. Raylene turned her gaze back to the horizon. Beyond the hills, she knew the great city sprawled, a sprawling metropolis that had once been a beacon of hope and innovation. Now it was a fortress of concrete and steel, its inhabitants clinging to the last vestiges of a world they could barely remember. The rivers that had once fed the city were choked with filth, their waters poisoned by the runoff from factories that still churned out goods no one really needed anymore. She reached the old pier, its wooden boards creaking beneath her weight. Here the water lapped gently against the pylons, though there was nothing gentle about the tide. It was a rising, relentless force, eroding the land bit by bit, and she could see where the sea had claimed more of the shore since she had last been here. The climate refugees, who had come from the drowned coastlines further south, had brought stories of entire towns swallowed by the ocean, of people fleeing with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Raylene had always wondered when it would be their turn, when the sea would finally rise up and take this place too. The maps had all predicted it, the scientists' warnings growing more dire with each passing year, but still, the world had continued on its path, as if it were immune to the consequences of its actions. She heard the faint hum of an engine in the distance, and she turned to see a small boat approaching the pier, its sides patched with rust and age. A man stood at the helm, his face as weathered as the vessel he piloted. He was one of the last fishermen, stubbornly clinging to a way of life that had all but disappeared. The fish he caught were small, their numbers dwindling with each catch, and each trip out to sea was a gamble with his life. But he persisted, as if by doing so he could hold back the tide, could somehow turn back the clock to a time before the world had gone so terribly wrong. As he pulled up alongside the pier, Raylene met his gaze. They didn't need to exchange words. The weariness in his eyes mirrored her own, a shared understanding of what they had lost and what was still slipping away. She reached out a hand to help him tie the boat to the dock, the rope rough and frayed beneath her fingers. "This can't go on much longer," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the lapping waves. She nodded, knowing he wasn't just talking about the fishing. They both knew the truth, though no one wanted to say it out loud. The world was on a path that couldn't be reversed, and each day brought them closer to the point of no return. Raylene glanced out at the water one last time, the horizon blurred by the haze. She couldn't help but wonder how much further the sea would creep inland before the world finally realized the cost of its choices. But by then, it would be too late. With a sigh, she turned and began to walk back up the pier, the sound of the waves following her like a whispered warning, a reminder of the future they had all but sealed for themselves.